Chemicals found in water surrounding Patrick Air Force Base are suspected of causing cancer in current and former Space Coast residents. The chemicals were once used in firefighting foam at the base and have also been found in alligators and dolphins in the Indian River Lagoon and at the Kennedy Space Center. Welcome to I Am Brevard. I'm Isadora Rangel. Florida Today environmental reporter Jim Waymer has been following this story for months now. He's my guest this week and will explain what the state and local governments are doing to figure out the link between these compounds and the cancer cases in our area. Watch. Jim, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been following the story of these cancer-causing chemicals that have been found in water surrounding Patrick Air Force Base. But you discovered the story a few months ago. Take us back to how you first heard about this and how this movement started and how the story has progressed ever since.
Well, yeah, I had been following the Department of Defense testing nationwide for this group of compounds called perfluorinated compounds. Now, they're in what the military uses for fire suppression training. When a plane crashes, catches fire, these are the groups of these fire foams. A lot of airports use it as well. Well, it's been this emerging contaminant of concern nationwide, and the Department of Defense was testing all of their bases. And Patrick Air Force Base, as part of that round of testing, found levels like 64,000 times what the EPA says is safe in drinking water. And so while that was going on, the general public was sort of hearing rumblings of this testing. And there was a oncologist who went to Satellite High, who's up in Jacksonville now, and she got a cancer, a very rare cancer, appendix cancer, in her early 30s. And her best friend died of breast cancer. And she started hearing about all these other friends via social media and this sort of avalanche from there. All these folks that grew up in that area or went to the schools out there saying, well, is there something beyond the norm happening here? So that's where we're at, this sort of grassroots level to really demand answers, because there were similar concerns that came up in the early 90s on this, where there was a radar out near Patrick that has since come down, but there were also concerns about what might have been buried near the base like decades ago.
And so are there studies or is there any proof that the cancer that this oncologist and other people have had was caused by these chemicals that were in the water, or is that still some hypothesis?
Yeah, that's just a theory at this point, because these chemicals, the science is emerging on it, but that to draw that direct connection between what you're seeing in the groundwater and what the types of cancers that are developing. Right now, they're just in the information gathering mode where they look by zip code and they say, are the observed cases beyond what you would expect, given what's happening statewide and nationwide with these categories of cancer?
And do we know yet whether our zip code and other bases around the country have a higher incidence of cancer, or is that still something that's being determined?
It's still something the state's looking at right now. I think we're a few months away from them having concrete results there. They're going to the Florida Cancer Registry, gathering all this information, and people are sort of ground truthing that here. There really has been this groundswell of people really demanding answers this time because of what happened in the 90s. They're thinking, was it swept under the rug? Was it really not that radar? Was there something else going on here? Now, they're on drinking water sources that are on the mainland. The city of Melbourne system has been predominantly the one of concern, because they did find one of the perfluorinated compounds, PFBA, in very trace amounts in several of the schools beachside. And it was only the schools on the Melbourne system, not the schools on the Cocoa system. So the thought now is, well, is there something different in the infrastructure out there? It's coming out of, they found it at the Melbourne water plant as well, so it was sort of similar levels. So I think, well, is there something that we're doing differently in our treatment process? And again, it was very low levels, and the city utility says the water is safe, according to them, according to the EPA. So they're looking at, to be proactive, they're looking, well, where is this PFBA coming from? And is it something we really need to do something about? I think there's maybe only one state that has a standard, and there's several thousand times below that standard.
And Melbourne city water, it comes from Lake Washington, right?
Part of it does. They mix it with groundwater.
So we have no idea why those chemicals are found in the water, even though it's, like you said, at traceable levels.
Right. There's theories. This is is there some sort of tape that was used on the plumbing fixtures or something like that, or something, the piping? But the fact that it's coming out of the plant itself right now, it's just sort of a giant open question.
And at least one of the things that I've heard is that these chemicals are found not only in that firefighting foam, but also in Teflon and Scotch tape. So any ideas? It seems like it's going to be very hard to pin down why those chemicals have flown into the water, right?
Yeah, a lot of those uses have been phased out over the years, so the levels in the environment should go down. The main concern is these firefighting foams, just because of the volumes of the stuff that they use and how fast it can migrate in the groundwater. These plumes can partition out and sort of go everywhere, but they don't really know. There hasn't been widespread monitoring outside the base boundaries to really know for sure where it might be migrating to. Now, they found it in the bottlenose dolphin. They found it in the alligator tissues up at the Space Center, because the shuttle program was using this for years as well. And so around the shuttle landing pad, they were finding this actually in the mullet, in the impoundment areas surrounding that landing strip where the shuttle comes down. So they thought, well, if it's getting in a staple food, is it going up magnifying up the food chain into the dolphins and other? It's thought that it's mostly contained in those impoundment areas, but it does beg the question: is there a bigger concern here?
And what are the impacts for dolphins and alligators, and are there any studies that show what can happen to these animals once those chemicals are found?
Well, there's been a federal study going on for a couple decades now about the sort of litany of these sorts of chemicals and all these things, industrial solvents, things that were used up on the Cape for decades. And the concern is that it might have immune suppression impacts, and that if you have sentinel cells that are supposed to find cancer and they're not doing their job, they're already seeing cancers. They thought that cancer was unheard of in bottlenose dolphin. So we've got this really stagnant estuary where all these compounds can build up the food chain. So the biologists that studying dolphin have been warning for years that, look, we're an apex mammal as well, so if it's affecting them, it could be having similar effects on us.
So you mentioned that Patrick Air Force Base, they stopped using that foam back in the 70s. Was there?
No, they started using it in the 70s.
They
stopped. They just shifted their engines out there in 2016. So just a few years ago that they transitioned off of this stuff.
And why did they transition off of it? Was it because of these concerns? Or
Yes,
was
it's
it
been going on
reason?
Department of Defense wide, that this was a phase out. The industry has phased out this stuff since the early 2000s, but it's been a gradual process, and that it's just sort of making its way to that particular use.
And even though officials have told us that it's safe to drink the water, what are you hearing from people who live on beachside, and do they trust officials when they say, the water is still safe to drink because the chemicals that have been found were at very low levels, or what is sort of the feeling that you get from the community?
No, they don't trust the government, and a lot of that, I think, dates back to what happened in the late 80s, early 90s, where they felt like this was somewhat whitewashed. And so there's been another grassroots movement for sort of to zero this stuff out in the water. Like the science is starting to sound like lead or mercury, where no amount of it is really safe, particularly for children, these more vulnerable groups. So they really want to get to the bottom of it. Where's this stuff originating from? What do you do to treat it out of the water? There was a push to try to get filtering systems at these beachside schools. Now there's no specific plan to do that at this point, but I don't think these people are going away. These are cancer survivors. These aren't victims. They're fighters. So they're going to keep pushing this time.
And you mentioned that there were 13 beachside schools that were tested, and again found at very low levels. But the EPA does not have standards for these chemicals. So how do we know that the water is safe to drink when there's no federal standard? Who determines how much is acceptable, how much of these kind of chemicals is not?
A lot of states have taken matters into their own hands with that. They're not going to wait on EPA. They don't. I think New Jersey has been proactive there. Minnesota has a standard for this particular chemical. And so their state health departments and environmental agencies, I think most likely from public pressure, are coming up with their own target levels. And that's a big part of the problem here. You know, the Patrick Air Force Base is waiting on EPA to come up with the groundwater target level. So saying, otherwise, how do we even delineate these plumes? How far do we keep going? At what trace amounts is the cleanup done?
Yeah, and we recently ran a guest column, basically saying that there's a lot of hysteria going on, that it's not as bad as it seems, that these chemicals are found in many products that we use daily. Any thoughts about that? Are there people who believe that, you know, it's being blown out of proportion?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're always going to have a faction there that's concerned about property values, that's concerned about any sort of mass hysteria developing, and whether or not, you know, Erin Brockovich is going to be visiting soon, and so does someone like her coming to town sort of muddy the waters a little bit, or are we sort of putting the cart before the horse on things? You know, and these sorts of issues are way beyond what local governments can handle. So where is the state here? Where is the leadership? Where is the professional environmental engineers that can really frame this and, you know, methodically go step by step and prevent that kind of hysteria?
And you sort of mentioned it, but what steps is the state taking to address this issue? We see a lot going on at the local level. What are the state and maybe even the federal governments doing right now?
Yeah, the state is taking the local data. There's a number that folks, if they're concerned, can call the county. It's 454-7101, and you'll get the county epidemiologists, and they're gathering that info, giving it to the state, and the state is, again, doing that zip code by zip code look and to see if there's anything significant going on there. And the thing is that you can have so much missing data in a process like that, and a zip code is a sort of a random polygon that, what if you move the area over here, then you might see a cluster, but if you move it over here, so it depends on where you look in space and time. So that's part of the challenge here, is that how are they going to define what is a cluster and what isn't?
Which is also, I imagine, a challenge for you, because we have both sides. We have these people, obviously, with serious concerns. I mean, they're cancer survivors. And then you have people who might be a little more skeptical. But where do you stand on this issue? Looking at the data, are we close to being able to draw a direct link between these cases of cancer and these chemicals, or not? I mean, what is your take on it?
Well, the one thing that has stuck with me that the oncologist who grew up here said, who's sort of the center of all this, is that if any community can solve this, it's Brevard County. There's a ton of really smart people here at the Space Center and elsewhere, and other spin-off industries that are here that really, and this time they're not going away. I don't think that, you know, folks maybe thought when that radar went down south of Patrick, maybe that really was the issue back then. There was an issue with Hodgkin's disease that within like just a several block area, you had about a dozen cases in about 16 years, and that's a very rare form of cancer. So they thought, well, maybe there was the radar was the main factor there. Since that's gone, maybe this will all kind of fade away. Well, we've had all these new cases, so I really think that there is the will and the know-how, or if they don't, where they don't have the know-how, the will find the know-how and really demand the answers.
And then you have all the liabilities issues and lawsuits and victims seeking compensation. Have you heard of any rumblings about that, and maybe groups mobilizing to go after Patrick Air Force Base or anybody else who might have been using this foam and the chemicals?
Not at this point. I mean, you have the sovereign immunity of the federal government, which is an issue. What I'm really hearing is that folks really are concerned about the next generation. They don't want to be here again 30 years later explaining to their kids and grandkids why they didn't figure this out when they had a chance for the second time to get answers. So it really seems to be legitimate, just wanting this to not happen to other people.
Are people not drinking tap water? Have you heard of anyone who's just buying bottled water or really refusing to drink any water?
I have heard just a few folks mention, well, can my child bring bottled water to school? These schools in question that have tested for the PFBA. And I haven't heard any large-scale concern to that regard, but I you know, and some folks are looking into filtering systems. You know, the carbon-activated filters can remove some of this stuff, not all of it. I mean, we're talking parts per trillion that are the levels that folks are concerned about here. So it's really difficult to get it to zero.
And like you mentioned, Erin Brockovich is going to be visiting Satellite Beach on Saturday, the September 29th.
Yes.
How did she hear about us? Do you have any idea? Was it just social media? What has prompted her visit? And she's going to different places in Florida, right?
Well, I talked to her water consultant, and he said, well, Satellite Beach is an area we've been hearing about for like over a year. And so it really was through social media, and she does her own, like the People's Registry sort of an approach where she maps out, you know, part of the difficulty improving a cluster is that people move, and there's a long latency period. So I think that's where she steps in and tries to fill those gaps. If somebody grew up in Satellite Beach but gets diagnosed in Colorado, she tries to close those gaps in the information and say, well, state, have you considered these cases that had moved away? Now look at it again. And so the thing is, yes, there does tend to be a lawsuit-oriented aspect of this, but I think it's so early, I don't think we're there yet for that sort of angle.
So she's just coming here. Is it just a photo op visit, or is she really going to meet with officials and?
She's going to hold a town hall.
A town hall, okay.
Yeah, and she has her water expert that comes in advance and sits down with all the local officials saying, here's what we bring to the table, bring me up to speed, what do you know, here's what our experience tells us, what these things you typically, you know, around these bases, this is what you typically see. They're working on, I think they've documented like 4,000 of these sorts of scenarios throughout the country. So they've been doing this for, I think that movie came out in 2000,
yeah.
And that case was settled in the 90s, so she's been at this for quite some time. Yeah.
And she actually ruffled some feathers when she criticized some of our local officials on Facebook. What did she say? No, what was the response from our local folks?
Yeah, there was a little back and forth there. I think there may have been a little misunderstanding. There was some stuff that was dug up south of the bay, one of the residential lots south of the bays, and so there was a video that went online, and I think there was another video from a recent town hall that was showing the city officials saying, well, this stuff's in our everyday product, and there was a perception there that maybe the local government was downplaying. So look, she's a renegade. She's going to light a fire under people. That's her way, and I think she just is a motivator and didn't maybe intend to make anybody look bad, but so you know, the city manager emailed her, say, hey, look, we're really looking into this. The state is as well. We're taking these steps. So I think that initially there was sort of that misunderstanding, but I think they're all singing from the same sheet of music now. So.
And so let's move on to the lagoon, because we can't forget about the lagoon, and we have these issues, but the lagoon is still in trouble. What is the status today of the lagoon? What is the health of the lagoon today for folks who haven't been following all of your stories?
Well, yeah, it's still struggling. They've always been, the resource managers have always been saying this is going to take years and years. It took years and years to get this bad. One interesting thing is I think we've lucked out so far, knock on wood, with the fish kills. We didn't seem to get the degree of summer fish kills that everybody was expecting given the conditions. Because if you look to the south of us, what's coming out of Lake Okeechobee.
And the algae blooms.
Right, the horrible
red
blooms
tide
down there. Yeah, and so we're sort of this pocket of I don't know, I guess we got a reprieve this year for some reason, but you still have those nutrients out there that have been there for decades. A lot of the dredging projects are ongoing, and so the Marine Resources Council, that's sort of the main environmental steward here locally, is going around with sort of a report card that they did. They looked at 5 things, and almost by segment of the lagoon, and almost every metric it failed.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what were some of those metrics?
Seagrass coverage, nitrogen and phosphorus inputs, things like the water clarity, things like that. They have a volunteer network that goes out every week, and they'll do the Secchi disc, and they'll look at
measure.
Right.
And you mentioned that we looked out because we haven't had any fish kills or significant fish kills this summer. Any particular reason why we get so lucky this time, especially when we look down south and we see algae blooms and red tides and all of that?
That's a really good question. I think there's some debate going on about that right now. I'd have to look at the rain data. A lot of times it's driven by the volumes of rain that we get. We get these heavy downpours that will pulse nutrients out into off the watershed into the river, and it will the algae bloom will go from there. So I don't think we really had those large-scale events that seem to drive the summer bloom.
So we've had a drier summer, it seems?
It seems that way, yeah, at least here regionally.
And obviously one major issue that you've covered throughout the years is the use of the sales tax to clean up the lagoon. What is the status of that? How much money has actually been spent so far? And you can just give me an approximation, but I mean, how much has been done in the last 2 years? Because my understanding is, you know, these things move quite slowly, I mean, or at least slower than most people would expect and hope, you know, because obviously you need permits and you cannot start one project until you finish the previous one. So where does the sales tax stand today?
Well, the spending has been in the tens of millions so far, but as we've been told all along, this is going to be like $1 billion endeavor or more. And so, again, we're so early in the process. And like you said, the permitting, getting those wheels spinning is a very slow one. And so at the county level, they've been wanting to streamline that permitting, trying to get the state to say, hey, can we do this like blanket permit? So every time we want to come back and dredge some muck, we don't have to jump through the same exact hoops every time. And so I don't know how much movement there's been in that arena. I think that's a big struggle with the state. And there's a ongoing debate on whether dredging is really the answer. Are we spending too much money and emphasis on that when we've got these huge sewage spills that we've had in the hurricanes? Shouldn't we really fix that infrastructure first, or at least put more attention on that than we have been?
And what is the response from the oversight committee when it comes to, you know, should we be spending more money into fixing sewage infrastructure in Brevard? One of the arguments I've heard, at least, is that there is an utility fee that people pay for sewage, and that should be going into fixing the infrastructure, but the fees have not, you know, increased enough to pay for those repairs. But what is the response that you often hear? Why not use that money for sewage?
I think it's let's not take our eye off the ball, sort of a philosophy that if we start getting distracted by let's focus on sewage infrastructure when there's already like over $130 million ongoing program that the county's utility has already bonded out for, and to get really bring the sewage infrastructure up to snuff. And so I think the thought is, well, if we start getting distracted by all these other issues, we're going to lose momentum at the state level, getting the state money when we're asking for everything under the sun. Their eyes are going to glaze over. So should we just really keep our eye on the ball and one thing at a time?
And there's always an issue du jour, you know, whatever is, you know, is more prominent in the news, and that people, I assume, you know, just jump on that and say, why aren't you doing more and more about this, right?
Well, particularly after Irma, when we had those, I think it was 20 million gallons of sewage spilled in Satellite Beach area. So people see that and smell that, then they want change yesterday. Yeah.
And speaking of Irma, we just kind of dodged a bullet with Florence, but we're still in hurricane season. And you covered a couple of big stories during Irma. First was the sewage spill in Brevard, and the second one was the failure of Coco's water system. It's been a year since Irma, and what has happened? What have our authorities and officials done to address the issue and make sure it doesn't happen this hurricane season?
Well, I'd say the local utilities, both Melbourne and Coco. Coco was the one that had the water main break across the lagoon. That they are a lot more proactive. They're taking every storm a lot more seriously in terms of let's not let these pipes get exposed again, these pipes that go under the lagoon. And so they've put millions of dollars into getting those pipes shored up and protected from the next storm. So I think that there was a little complacency there in that we hadn't had a major storm in so long. Well, maybe we can wait one more year before we get that kind of thing done. Not so much anymore. Or do we have to check after every single storm? Oh, maybe not. That storm wasn't so bad. The thinking's changed. Now it's, well, maybe we need to check after every single tropical storm or tropical event, that we need to get out there, get under the water and look at the condition of those pipes.
And you mentioned there's millions of dollars going into repairing our sewage system. How much has been done in the last year to prevent a future spill?
For the sewage system, I think that's, again, fits into the ongoing over 130 million in upgrades. It takes so long to replace all that piping, and it's very disruptive. And so there's been a lot of work in that South Patrick area and Satellite Beach area, getting those old pipes modernized. So again, it's ongoing, and everybody wants these things to happen yesterday, but it's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and now we have more money that we can use, right? From the tourism development tax, there's a new law that allows that money to be used not only for tourism but for infrastructure. Are there people calling for Brevard County to use those dollars? Because I mean, and if viewers haven't been following this, was very controversial because the tourism industry says we need those dollars to advertise and to attract more tourists, and then you have another group saying let's put more money into the lagoon. You see any movement towards that? The county, using that money more for the lagoon and sewage and et
I think so. I think they're taking it very seriously. I think that everybody knows the value of the estuary here, the economic importance of it, and just the perception, the optics of these gargantuan sewage spills that make headlines. That's not helping anybody's property values. That's not helping the perception of this community outside of the borders. So I think it's being taken very seriously.
Jim, thank you so much for being on the show once again.
Thank you.
That's Eye on Brevard for this week. You can rewatch this episode on Florida Today's YouTube page. I'll see you again next week.